All right. Hey, anybody that's tuning in online and everybody here, just a quick reminder, all of this is live streamed and the mics we are using are actually in the ceiling and they pick up everything, so don't say anything that you would regret. And if you ask any questions, the people online will be able to hear you as well. So welcome to Flutter Atlanta. My name is Emmett Dean. I'm an engineering manager over the Flutter team here at Black Airplane. I have a background in native Android and iOS development, and I've been using Flutter for a little over 3 years now. We've published over 12 different Flutter apps, and we have several more in progress, and I love Flutter so much that I use it for my own side projects. I want to give a quick shout out to Black Airplane as a thank you for the food and the beer. Black Airplane is a leading development agency in the Southeast, and we have a pretty special team here that can produce top quality work and build pretty much everything these days. So today we're going to be talking about preparing your app for the App Store. So before you even really build an application, or especially before you go through the submitting process, you need to look into the App Store guidelines. Apple is notoriously more strict for this, but you need to make sure you read through all of the App Store guidelines, which you can find just by Googling them, and make sure your app doesn't have any conflicts. Some notable guidelines are the Google or Apple tax. If you are selling digital products in your app, make sure you're going through in-app purchases because Apple will reject your app if they're not getting their 30% cut on whatever you're trying to sell. They also have a rule for minimum functionality. They do not want you to just wrap a basic web page and publish it as an application. Your app should have some sort of functionality there that is more enhanced than a traditional just landing page website. There's also objectionable content. So there's a whole lot of restrictions around gambling, sexual content, anything like that. So make sure you're adhering to those rules. User-generated content is also very important. They have a lot of guidelines around moderation with this content. So any kind of user-generated content has to be flaggable for reporting. You have to be able to block people and all sorts of different things so that the users can be in control of what user-generated content they see on your app. There's also app completeness, so if you have any weird padding or button overflows or anything like that, Apple can and will reject you for that. And then also accurate metadata, which we'll talk about how intense that is in just a minute. Now for the hard part. You guys have built an app, but this is actually the hard part because getting something approved by Apple is no easy task. Before you actually go and distribute your app, though, you should know there's 4 different types of distribution. There's the App Store distribution, which is what we're primarily going to be talking about today. Then there's also ad hoc distribution, which you can install on only designated devices that are baked into an iOS certificate. There's Enterprise, which is a little bit different process to get, but it allows you to distribute your app internally and host that app on your own website. And then there's also the development, which allows you to distribute this app to any of your internal team members. Before you actually go publish your app on any app store, you will need to set up 2 different developer accounts. So a Google Play developer account is $25 one-time fee, and then an Apple developer account is $100 a year. Their enterprise account is more expensive if you end up going that route. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is metadata hell. So here at Black Airplane, we do a lot of work for clients, and a lot of our clients think that publishing an app is similar to publishing a website, where all you do once that website is done is hook up a domain, and then it's live. But the app publishing process requires a huge amount of metadata and all sorts of screenshots and graphics that you have to create. So we're going to run through this real quick just so you guys get an understanding of all of the things that you're going to have to prepare when it comes time to actually submit your app. So first off is, of course, just on the Android side, your name, the short description, the full description. They require a high-res app icon that's specifically used for the App Store. They have a feature graphic, which is kind of an odd size, so a lot of your other graphics may not fit this. You're going to have to custom make this specifically for the Android App Store. You have to have at least a minimum of 2 phone screenshots. Same goes for the tablet screenshots if you are supporting tablet. And you have to do it for all of these different devices that you support. You have to specify if your app is either an app or a game, and then also if it is an app, go through all of the categories, pick a category that best describes your application. You have to set up tags for your application, which is going to help with searching and keywords. and then as well as contact details to publicly display in case anything is wrong with your application. After that, you have to get into the privacy policy, which both Apple and Google are very intense on right now. So you're going to have to go either get a legal team to get a privacy policy made, or there are some online generators for these if you're an indie developer just trying to publish something yourself. But this is something that could cost a lot of money for your clients depending on if they plan for this or not. You have to talk about your ad usage and what data is being gathered from your app to display these ads. App access, so who is actually going to be able to access your app, what countries, the pricing, and everything like that. You'll go through a content rating test, which talks about the app, which you basically fill out a questionnaire and gives it kind of an ESRB rating that says 3+, 10+, whatever the age range is based on the content that's in your app. You have to set up your target audience and who that content is so that they know who you're trying to target specifically. You have to specify if your application is a news app so that they can treat it differently in case you're trying to post fake news. You have to specify if your app is a COVID contact tracing app, which, fun fact, I actually built one of these at the beginning of COVID and then got rejected because they were starting to come out with this rule where you couldn't have COVID contact tracing apps. And then also you have to go through their data safety questionnaire, which basically any information you gather from your user, you have to specify that you're using it and how you're using it and why your app needs it. And then last but not least is your advertising ID. If you're gathering the device's advertising ID and send it out anywhere, you have to specify to who and why. So that's just the Android side. That's one app store to get you into the submission process. iOS, a lot of this items are similar, but they're just different enough to make you have to go through a whole nother list. So talking about these, they're way more specific on their screenshots. As you can see, you have 5 devices that you absolutely must supply screenshots for, especially if you have a tablet. And that's the 6.7 inch, 6.5 inch, 5.5 inch, 12.9 inch, 6th gen iPad, and 2nd gen iPad. So for those, your designers are going to hate it because those actually have to be pixel perfect. On Android, your screenshots, as long as they're a 9:16 aspect ratio, they will give you the thumbs up. But all of those screenshots have to be exactly specific for iOS. Something else, a lot of your screenshots in the App Store, you may try and spice them up. You've seen applications that have like a picture of a phone with the app in it in screenshots. If you are publishing on iOS, the devices in your screenshots have to be iPhone or iPad devices. If you put an Android or generic looking phone in your screenshot, they will reject it just because it's not an iPhone in your screenshot. So they're very specific about that. After that, you have promotional text, a full description, and then you get 100 characters for keywords. If you're doing any of the App Store optimization stuff, which we'll talk about at the end of this, this is just like SEO trying to drive traffic to your application. These are the keywords that are going to allow your app to pop up during search. After that, you have a support URL, which you have to host a separate website other than the application with contact information or a way for them to reach out to you. And this is going to be publicly displayed and is absolutely required now if you're going to publish your app. There's an optional marketing URL. You have to, of course, specify the version, copyright information. You have optional routing coverage, which specifies GeoJSON data on where this should be allowed. If you have any add-ons to your Apple app, like App Clip, iMessage app, Apple Watch apps, they have completely optional and separate metadata to support those. So again, if you have an Apple Watch app, you have to support all sorts of different screenshots for that as well. And then of course you have the basics, like your name, your subtitle, your primary and secondary categories. You have to specify your content rights. So if you have any third-party content going into your application, you have to specify if you have the rights to use that. You go through a similar age rating process as you do on the Android side. And then of course you also set up your pricing and availability, your privacy policy again, and then your user privacy choices. So this is an additional privacy policy because on Apple you can reject them to access certain things now. And then the Apple Privacy Explainer, which is basically the exact same as the privacy questionnaire on the Android side. So as you can see, this is no small task. Typically, whenever we build an app for a client, the very first meeting, we send them this list because it takes them the entire length of us building their application for them to get all of these things together. So start this early. Don't wait till the last second. And doing this just to do it is one thing. Doing it well is an entirely other thing. If you just want to pop out screenshots, you can get this done, all this done in a day. It's not that bad. But if you're trying to do custom screenshots with the devices, with specific wording and doing keyword analyzing, it can be quite a pain to keep all of this updated as you're releasing updates as well. The next thing you need to do is switch over to the proper app signing. If you've just set up your Flutter application, you have some debug profiles and everything out of the box so it will at least run, but you need to either follow the Flutter or CodeMagic instructions on setting up the Android release signing config with your custom key store, and also switch out any Apple development certificates for the official distribution ones. This is the certificates that are going to be used to sign your app at the build time, so that way you can distribute it on whatever distribution method that you're going for. Next is delivering your app to the App Store. So the old-fashioned way is to run builds on your local machine just by doing Flutter Build IPA or Flutter Build App Bundle, and then uploading just by drag and drop on the Google Play Store with your app bundle or APK, and then you'll be able to start releasing that build of your application. Apple is a little bit more complicated. You have to use if you run the build command in Flutter, you have to use a separately downloaded app outside of Xcode called Transporter, which then allows you to deliver it to the App Store. If you don't want to go that route, you can also run a build actually in Xcode, which will then pop up a way to distribute it from there. If you set up CI/CD, which we'll talk about now, all you would have to do is run your release workflow. This is one of the beauties of a nice CI/CD setup, is it might take you some extra time at the beginning, but then when you're done, when everything's checked out and reviewed and you're ready to make another release, you can just hit one button and then sit back for the next hour while your machine runs, and then it'll pop up beautifully in the App Store. So let's look at that. Again, here at Black Airplane and for my personal projects, I use a CI/CD tool called CodeMagic. The CEO of CodeMagic actually came to one of our earlier meetups and was super helpful and answered a whole bunch of our questions. They've made it great even for beginners. You can use custom YAML pipeline the old-fashioned way if you want to, or for amateurs like myself, you can just use this nice UI to set up everything, and they have great instructions on doing so. So I want to point out and go through this step by step. For this application that I'm making, this is actually a side project of mine called Magitalk, and I have support for web, iOS, and Android. So at the very top, I select all three of these, and you're actually going to see how this one workflow also publishes for web on Firebase hosting. So that's kind of a bonus with this workflow. Build triggers, there's no automatic build triggers because I only want to run this when I want to. If you were on a larger team, you might have a standardized release cycle that you can make this automatically run once a week or on a specific maybe master branch push or whatever it is for you that it indicates it's time to submit a new release. So the first thing you'll see on our environment variables here is I have my Firebase token. This is specifically just for publishing the web app to Firebase hosting, and this is just used in one of my build scripts later on. I don't have any dependency caching. I want to make sure if I'm publishing this app, there's nothing weird saved from past builds. A lot of people will use this if they're doing like a nightly build or a testing build that's running every pull request, so that way it doesn't have to fresh install all of your pub.dev dependencies every time. So you can just save money on the build minutes you're using by using dependency caching, but for my sake, I don't really need that, especially since I'm just one team publishing this app. So the very first thing, there's this gear that allows me to run my very first script. So in this application, I'm using a code generation tool called Build Runner. I use both freezed and JSON serializable, which are very common packages in Flutter that'll automatically make it so my data classes kind of have JSON parsing without me having to manually write JSON parsing. So here in my pre-test script, I run this command that'll automatically generate all of those files. You can put anything here if you have any sort of very custom setup or have a whole bunch of scripts you need to run before building your app. They have room to put that here even with the nice UI. And then it goes into the tests. So I don't have any actual tests written for this app because this is just me. I didn't dedicate the time to this. This app was basically built in 24 to 48 hours, start to finish. But I do have my static code analysis. So I have my Flutter analyzer set up here, and something I normally do on other projects as well is code coverage. So it's very easily here with the Analyze tool built into Flutter to actually generate code coverage, which you can send off to like codecov.io and track your percentage of code coverage on how well you're testing your entire application. So there's a lot of options with Flutter to actually make sure that everything is covered just as you would want in like a top tier enterprise application. Heading down to the build section, here I pretty much have everything at the default except some of these build arguments. So I'm using the default Flutter version, the latest Xcode version, default CocoaPods version. If you have some sort of beta distribution, or if you prefer using APKs, you can either switch this from an app bundle to an APK or generate both. You'll want to make sure if you're releasing to the App Store, you have this mode switched to release instead of debug. Oh, I'm actually going to restart this for you. You asked about CI/CD, so we'll run through this real quick. Back to the top for you. This CI/CD workflow is a release workflow that you can run whenever you want instead of doing builds the old-fashioned way. And this workflow specifically does Android, iOS, and web. So at the beginning, I'm doing my code generation as well as doing some Flutter analyzing, and this is where you would run your test if you had your unit and integration tests. And so now at the build section, this is where I'm actually setting up everything for building the Android, iOS, and web builds. So again, you can select what kind of Android build format you would like and the mode. If you're releasing to the App Store, you need to make sure this is in release mode. And then here I kind of have some automatic versioning. So you can actually change the version of a Flutter app just straight through build arguments. The reason I have this in my release flow personally is I always forget to change the build number on my personal projects. And what that does with Apple is as soon as I go to upload my new version, Apple rejects it immediately because it's the same version, and then I have to spend all that time making another build. So I was tired of that, so I added this in automatically to have my back. So it'll automatically integrate or increment my build numbers and the build name every time my workflow runs. For web, I have a package that only seems to work with a specific web renderer, so I also have that thrown in here as well. After the build, this is actually when I run my web deploy. So this is the web deploying is the only custom scripts part of this. Everything else is built into the UI right out of CodeMagic. You don't have to do anything special there. So here I'm just running my Firebase deploy only hosting with the token. And I have everything set up in my project to know exactly where the hosting folder is. So Flutter build web runs. It has the nice index HTML, everything packaged up, and then that's what's uploaded directly to Firebase hosting. So at this point, we have the web distribution of our release workflow complete.
Just scroll that higher for walking some of that.
And then you have the distribution section of CodeMagic, and this is where you actually have the Android code signing, the iOS code signing, and then also, in this case, I've set up Google Play and App Store Connect distribution. So your Android code signing, this is where you're going to actually have your key store. So if you follow the instructions either here or on the Flutter documentation, this is what I talked about switching the code signing. So they're going to walk you through generating a key store for your Android application and then also changing some of your signing configs to switch it from a debug config to a release config. This is what's going to actually allow you to distribute this application. But this key store, you have to upload into your CI/CD platform, so that way it knows how to sign it. They also recommend typically don't actually commit that file into any repositories, so it's important that you have it stored securely on something like this. The iOS code signing is very similar. In this case, I have it set up as automatic because I linked my Apple developer account. We'll look at that in a second. But if you wanted to do manual, you could actually upload the provisioning profiles and the distribution certificates here, and it'll automatically sign it with that for you. So that is that. But the more interesting portion of this is linking both your Google Play account and the App Store Connect account. So again, CodeMagic's documentation is truly second to none when walking you through this. So the way it does this is it allows you to get API access to both of the developer consoles. Google's way of doing this is through a service account. So they have these awesome screenshots where you can walk through step by step, create a service account, and then you actually give that service account permissions to be able to upload and manage basically your App Store listing. And then all you have to do is download this JSON file, and we hand it back to our CodeMagic, and then you can kind of set up your settings from here. So you can determine which track you want to publish this to, internal, alpha, beta, production, those are kind of the built-in to Google Play. And then you can opt for options like don't send it to changes for review or submit the release as a draft and everything like that. Me personally, I don't like my apps automatically getting submitted to review. For me, I'm happy to get them uploaded so I don't have to do the uploading step, but once it's in that uploading step, I want to double check everything before I actually hit the submit button. App Store Connect is very similar, so you basically follow a similar documentation that is going to walk you through signing into your App Store Connect and generating an API access key, and then we just bring that back to CodeMagic, and now CodeMagic has access here. And again, you can automatically have it submit to test flight beta review, distribute to beta groups, and even submit all the way to App Store review if that's what you want. So depending on what kind of beta testing you're doing as well, here at Black Airplane we typically do Firebase app distribution, so it's all in one place. But if you have the hookups for Google Play and App Store Connect automatically, you can have it automatically distribute to your beta testers in like a nightly workflow as well. So that's the really fancy part of that kind of setup. So at the end you have some notification options, but that generally is the release workflow. So you can set up all of that, especially just for the Android and iOS, without having to write any sort of custom YAML pipeline. The only customization I did here again were the couple of scripts I needed to run to auto-generate my JSON serializable files, and then also do my web deploy to my web server. But other than that, that's all you have to do to automatically just hit a button and it'll handle it for you. Yep.
So is there anywhere you can have, I saw that you have code analyzer, right? I mean, static code analyzer. Anything related to the accessibilities or those kind of steps are built in it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Accessibility test.
Accessibility tests, so yes. So if you were to write accessibility tests, all of that would actually be included in your repository under the testing section. And then you can just run these integration and unit tests here. So you just enable it. If you need some sort of custom arguments, you can do that as well. And you can even choose, as you can see here, run on different simulators if you want to.
So that would be considered under integration test or unit test?
For accessibility tests, it would probably be an integration test, I imagine. Heading back to this. So as you can see, this is quite the journey. Publishing an app is not easy. You've gone through metadata hell. You've set up a CodeMagic thing to automatically help with your deploys, because this is not going to be the last time you publish your app. This is the very first tip of your journey. So some tools to help along the way. For design, all the design work we do here, all the design work I do on the side, I typically use Figma. It's very developer friendly, it's very easy to use, so you're going to be able to make some nice screenshots for yourself with that. There's also a Flutter package called Screenshots that can help you automatically generate those screenshots. So you can basically run a Dart command and it will spin it up on all the different simulators you need, take the screenshots of whatever screens you tell it to, and then put it in a folder for you to upload. So this kind of tech has been around for a while. I remember seeing it back in like the Fastlane days. So if you want to speed it up like that with automated screenshots, more than welcome to. Some other tools that I personally use are Jasper.ai. I'm sure you've heard about some of these copywriting AIs. You have 4,000 characters to write an app description. I haven't written an essay since like high school, so I'm going to use an AI to help me write my app description, and it's pretty impressive stuff if you haven't messed around with it before. As for your privacy policy terms and conditions, again, you pretty much have two options. You can look into some generators that can help you get a very basic one if you're an indie developer to get your app out there, or if you're a bigger corporation, you'll have a legal team that will provide this for you. But if you need a generator, one of the popular ones is termly.io that can at least get you something basic. And then of course we went over our CodeMagic setup, which again, I'm a big advocate for. And CodeMagic allows you to do all those fancy CI/CD things and save the time every time you're trying to publish your application. Next is Firebase app distribution. Something we do here for our clients is every single night they get a nightly build with the latest version of their app. And that might not work, but it's going to be whatever was all merged in at the end of the day. So our clients here every single night get an email that says there's a new version of your app. And if you want to check out whatever the progress is, they can have that right there. And the transparency is loved. As you guys know, as developers, to a lot of normal business people, we're magicians. So if you're able to take away some of the magic and show them actually what you're doing, they're going to build a lot of trust with you. And Firebase app distribution and CodeMagic together is a great way of achieving that. You did it. You got your app on the App Store. So what's next? Well, there's a couple steps that I highly recommend, one of which is using the in-app review package. One big thing I learned early on in my app days is people will not review your app unless you ask them to. And this is a very easy way, after they do a significant action in your app, pop this up. It's that generic rating pop-up that asks them to give you a couple stars and they can write a review if they want. That's going to help your App Store listing tremendously. It's time to start marketing your new launch, telling everybody about it, and then also start learning about App Store optimization to help optimize your listing. There's a lot of companies out there that help you do keyword research, kind of like SEMrush on web. You have App Annie, which became Data.ai, which is an enterprise level that helps you kind of spy on competitors' keywords and everything like that and get your App Store ranking. And there's also Sensor Tower, which is another option there. So there's a couple tools out there that can help you optimize actually listing your app on the App Store. But that is everything. Next time we're going to be doing a Christmas special. We don't know exactly what that means yet, but we're going to be building a Christmas themed something. So stay tuned for that, just trying to do something a little fun for the holidays. But other than that, are there any questions?
Okay, question for you. When you go back to the build situation for CodeMagic, please. And so one of the challenges we have is, especially when the operating system gets updated, your build environments change as well. So you have to, a specific version of Xcode, for example, and do that type of thing. How do you direct things in CodeMagic to say, I want to use this in implementation of an operating system or a build environment?
So they have some options on build machines, and the build machines you can change, I believe, in your team settings. I may not have access to it on my individual account, but I know they have Linux build machines. They have Mac Pros if you want to build faster, and then now they've actually upgraded to M1 Mac Minis, which is great for us because it used to take a really long time to build these Flutter apps, and you pay by the minute. So them upgrading their system actually means we pay them less, which is great for us. But if you need a specific Flutter version, you can specify this here. They're very quick on updating these and coming out with the latest. They have a Slack channel if you ever need help, and you can just send them a build ID if something goes wrong. So here's where you're actually going to set up most of your versions with your Flutter, Xcode, and then CocoaPods. This is also why we typically run full builds nightly, even if nothing has changed, because we've had builds succeed for a month straight for an old client, and then all of a sudden it starts failing because the latest version of Flutter or the latest version of Xcode causes a problem. And at least then we're aware of it and we can go let them know.
So they host the build machines. You don't have to worry about any part of managing the DevOps environment other than what you script here.
Correct. And the billing is all basically usage-based. So here it's actually disabled. Let me see if I can go to my... So, haven't been in here in a while.
You know where these guys are based out of?
He was based out, the CEO was based out of like Denmark. I'm not sure exactly where they are based out of, but here's the billing overview. So as you can see, a standard Mac OS VM was that 3.8 cents a minute. Premium is like a cent a minute, or no, 10 cents a minute almost. And then they have just a whole bunch of options here. So they do even have some Windows VMs now, and you can kind of specify at some level which machines you want them to use. It's going to default to a standard Mac instance because that's the only thing you can build iOS on. And then if you want to be able to run multiple builds at the same time, they have specific plans to get on for that. So if you have a big team running builds every time you have a pull request open or something like that.
Okay. I think there was some questions about running tests, unit tests, UI tests, and that type of things. I'm familiar with certain companies, and there's one here in Atlanta. Think about it in a minute. But Cobaton is the name of the company. And they allow you to kind of drop your build on a machine and then run it remotely and kind of do some other things. Do you know if there's a hook in here for you to connect to, say, like the AWS build machines or whatever, so you can test your apps?
Yep,
directly?
so they have both support for the AWS device farm, and then I think Google also has their version of that now as well. Again, if it's a smaller company, not like that big, CodeMagic might not have specific documentation for it, but I know they have documentation for setting it up for the AWS device farm. So if it's anywhere close to similar to that, which I imagine it is, you'll be able to follow that guide to set it up.
Is there anything that you find missing in this situation? Like you have to kind of step back and actually grind out something with Xcode directly or Xcode server in order necessarily to do some like iOS builds correctly?
I've had no issues with the iOS building. Typically, if it builds locally for me, it's going to build on here. And we've even had some pretty complex iOS projects, like when we use the Square Reader SDK, which they have to supply you a binary attached to the Square account that's baked into the application. And setting that up was painful. But as soon as we got it building on a local machine and device, it built on here just fine.
Because some things that we've seen so far is like, if you want to run, especially on iOS, let's say you're trying to do some testing for connectivity, because you can kind of ramp down 3G, 5G, whatever, or Wi-Fi, that you kind of have to divert to those specific tools that Xcode provides you. But I mean, just to be able to crank this out and see what breaks the build is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine if you need like full-on simulator access, because you're talking about changing a simulator setting to throttle the network, you probably would have to go out to an AWS device farm to run it on something like that. And I imagine they may give you the tools to change those settings if you want to. Otherwise, there may be other ways to simulate that in Flutter tests.
Because we've used App Center for the same type of distribution you're doing. So we do local signing using the enterprise license, especially for iOS distribution. Does that also support things here? So for example, if you want to distribute through Flutter for a non-stored submission for iOS, you have to kind of go through the enterprise license situation, right?
Yep.
So you have the ability to kind of flip between.
Yep, so I've done an enterprise through here with a custom certificate, but I believe, you would have to export your profile manually, so you would switch this to like manual, and then you would upload your code signing certificate and provisioning profile. And if those are enterprise, it works just fine.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So do you guys, does CodeMagic support any kind of, I know PubDev is the only repository package. Is there anywhere that they can connect, or I don't know if there is any enterprise level PubDevs which we can host within the companies? Do you know any of it?
Like hosting your own packages for your company internally?
Yeah.
We've built some packages internally here. We just host them on like our GitHub as private repositories. So actually in your pub spec, you don't have to specify a version. You can also specify a Git link. So as long as your CI/CD has access to whatever Git repositories your pub spec is referencing, it works just fine with that as well.
But if you want to share with other teams, still you use the same GitHub and use the pub spec for sharing with other people?
Well, PubSpec was public, right? You can't control the access of a module at PubSpec, right? It's like CocoaPods. So if you want to manage your own repository, you're going to have to set your own repository up and have this thing have access back into it, like you had to set up a service account before, because most enterprises have everything behind their own firewall for their builds environments, right? And so that you've got your own asset repository that you're managing, JFrog or what have you in there, right? And so this is an external source that would have to have access back in, unless you're able to take this infrastructure and deploy it internally for your builds.
So JFrog can be hosted internally?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I was not. Okay.
So So we have a very large client that we manage their infrastructure builds as well as their mobile app builds, and everything's managed internally. So we run SonarCube against things, running code tests and that type of thing before we ever do cuts.
But yeah, typically for us, we don't have any enterprise level firewalls like that. We host it on a private Git repository, and you can actually reference those directly inside your pub spec, which is good to know in case you're using a package who hasn't officially released an update yet, but they have a fix on a branch. You can actually reference specific branches and get repositories directly in your pub spec and access them. And as long as the GitHub or GitLab account that you're signed into on CodeMagic has access to all those repositories, then it will build just fine, even if they're private repositories.
I was trying to do something similar along with the inner source. So throughout the enterprise, they can have a repositories that can be shareable and reusable.
Yeah.
But since this is an external build tool, if you have to kind of change your perspective of how you do enterprise builds, you'd almost have to say, I have a private repository in GitHub that people can have access to, and you can manage that. I mean, they do that all the time. And then that way, this thing as an external tool would have access because you give it a service account back into your external GitHub account, then it can do the builds and pulls from there. In fact, have you ever played with GitHub Actions? I mean, it's almost like another CI/CD process, right?
I looked at that because it was coming out about the time I was looking for a tool like CodeMagic. The reason I went with CodeMagic was purpose-built for Flutter, and I didn't have to learn too much to use this UI. GitHub Actions, though, I know that they're starting to get some Flutter out-of-the-box actions. So if you were very hardcore in the GitHub ecosystem and wanted to use their custom actions, you could definitely do that as well.
So it beats the crap out of running Jenkins scripts, that's for sure.
Yep. Any other questions?
Maybe it's not quite relevant to this, but how is, I mean, just a general for everybody maybe, how is the people resources like, do you guys see enough people in the market?
It's getting better. The biggest thing is going to be finding senior Flutter people because it hasn't been around that long. Like you're not going to find somebody with 10 years of Flutter experience because Flutter hasn't been around for 10 years. But it's growing rapidly. You can see that just from the amount of action that they're getting on GitHub. A lot of people are using Flutter. And with Flutter Showcase showing off some of the bigger companies that are using it, which we pull this up pretty often, we can pull it up again. There are big companies starting to use Flutter, and these again are just going to be ones that you can probably go look at. There's a lot of internal tools that you don't even know about that are starting to use Flutter, but BMW, Google Pay, of course, Nubank, and then they have like the Alibaba group. It was like eBay Motors, was built in this. iRobot apps. So there's all sorts of stuff that are coming out. Reflectly won an App Store award for design. It was built in Flutter. A lot of the people that are listed on here also have YouTube videos talking about why they chose Flutter and the things that they loved about Flutter. Of course, it's on Flutter's YouTube channel. They're probably not going to say anything bad, but it talks a lot about why they made that decision and the flexibility it gave. There's some really impressive tools like Rive, which is an animation option. Here's the video, but this is basically like a full-on After Effects built completely in Flutter, used to export animations that are widely used in Flutter. So as you can see in like just this kind of screenshot over here, they have a full like layer editor and timeline with keyframes and all of that built in Flutter. It's definitely getting to the point where if you're wondering if you can build it in Flutter, there's very, very little things that you can't build in Flutter. A lot of it's just going to be should you. Like with certain web applications, it's should you use Flutter. But pretty much everything can get built at this point.
I work for a international systems integrator firm, and we're getting a lot of pressure from our clients to start doing this.
Flutter?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a perception out there that to do an application for web and for mobile, you either come from a responsive web design point of view, React, what have you, and React Native, which don't exactly play really nice together. Or you go into this type of a solution, which is, people are starting to kick the tires on this a little bit more.
I think you are not there. I was asking similar question to them. So I think most of the enterprises getting into a motto like app first kind of thing,
Yeah.
where it internally goes towards the web. So one code for iOS, Android, as well as web at later stage. So think as an app first delivery touch point for the user, and web is another
Right.
byproduct for it.
Right. I help clients think through things from an architectural standpoint. And one of the very simple things I start off with is think of a 3-layer cake. You have systems of engagement, systems of integration, systems of record. What this does is talk about specifically systems of engagement.
Yeah.
And if you can get that to talk to your API layers as your systems of integration, then applications work as good as anything else, really.
Make sure Randall doesn't have any questions. Think we're good?
Sorry, last question. I think similar to the JFrog, I was looking for Nexus, the
Yeah.
other two. Can we use that? I didn't see any like out of the box situation. Do you guys anybody used it?
If you're talking about CodeMagic specifically, you probably have to look at
I'm
it.
just talking about hosting my own Flutter packages on a repository.
So that's part of the build question, right? So as long as you can get access to whatever server you're pulling the resource from,
Okay.
the Nexus server, then you should be fine. But you're getting back to the access question about how you're gonna build that. So if you're hosting your own build infrastructure internally to your enterprise, do what you want. I mean, you got all the tools there.
I was exploring Bitrise to open up a VPN tunnel.
Yeah.
And then open that part. I work for Equifax, so our security is very big thing for us. So
Yeah. I got some good friends over there, especially in the security department.
okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody tuning in online. Come back next month for